in the first of our tutorial, in the first of this tutorial series, we dealt with how you do just a basic miter square. So we have that right here, and this is of a thicker yarn that I'm using in my blanket, but we learned the basic principles of creating a mitered square. And as you can see, this is different than these other squares in that this is a much smaller profile center line than this is. And I decided I'd like this a little better in my blanket. Now, as you're making your mitered square blanket, you can decide if you want them all the same direction, if you want them different directions. It all depends on how you start your square and where your first corner is and your decreases, because that will determine the line. If I had cast on here and then done this and had these two be my initial sides, then my line would go this way. And there's all kinds of different patterning you could do. This tutorial, because it's how I'm doing it and established, and I'm showing you how I'm doing it in my blanket, is going to discuss how I do my squares. Now I also have this extra line around them. So I'm going to talk to you, this is our basic mitered square, and the mitered square tutorial is in this series, and so that's the basic. Now, first of all, I'm going to talk about this next little tutorial. We're not going to actually do a square in this one, but I'm going to talk to you about what I did and how I set it up and how I started. So my very first square was this one right here. So I'm starting basically in my bottom right hand corner of my blanket, or top, but as I'm knitting it, it's the bottom right hand corner. And then I'm building this way, I'm building out from there. So I did this basic square just like I did my beginning, my basic mitered square. I used different number of stitches. So in a fingering weight yarn, I have 22 stitches on each side with a center stitch. I am doing mine with a border around it. So I do 3 rows, 3 front rows, and 3 back rows of the gray. Then I switch to my color, whatever my color is. Now let me make sure I have that right. So 1, 3, yeah. So basically 6 rows. My initial 6 rows are in here. So I have 3 front rows and 3 right side rows and 3 wrong side rows. So I start and end in this corner. Then I have my color, my main color that I'm working with, and I just go till I run out. Then I pick up stitches, and here I pick up stitches along this side, and then I cast on stitches. When I'm doing this, I cast on stitches, and then I pick up stitches. And I'll show you how each of these kinds of squares are done. Then you may also notice in my blanket I have rectangles, which are the equivalent of just 2 squares, and also giant squares, which are the equivalent of 4 squares. I basically follow Danny of Prairie Girls pattern, and she has hers up on the on Ravelry. And I looked at her pattern and I'm basically following it. Now this tutorial is going to cover how I implement it and how I work my corners, how I do my centers, how I pick up my stitches, all of those little kinds of things. Like I said, there's this direction of rectangle. There's also this direction of rectangle. So a vertical rectangle. And sometimes I won't be able to get back to them right away, or they'll be a little bit. So I'll talk to you about how I deal with these extra stitches that aren't knit when I'm doing my rectangle. So we'll talk about all of that. I chose, now, placement, layout, color choices, things like that. Let's discuss that for a little bit. So I chose a dark gray, a kind of steel gray. Lots of people do it in black, which is very beautiful. I chose this steely gray just because it seemed to remind me most of the lead and a leaded window. And I'm very pleased with this. So I bought several skeins of heritage silk, and I keep this color just kind of permanently in my little yarnet here. And because it has silk content in it, it gets wound up with some toilet paper around it, which just kind of comes off as my little yarnet is spinning around. So this is heritage silk from Cascade Yarns, and it is color, let's see if I can find the color. The color is 5631. So that's the color, and it's this heritage silk Cascade Yarns. 85% merino superwash wool and 15% silk. So this is what I use, and this is my second skein of the gray on the size of blanket that I have at the moment. And I think I bought a lot of skeins of this because I could use it. So make sure you get enough, or that it's sourced so that you can finish, because you do want all of your edges to be the same color. All right, so how do I lay out and how do I choose what to put where and how to decide which direction things go and everything else? Well, if you look at my Instagram and follow my Instagram at Genuine Knits, then you can, that's where I have most of the pictures of this, and you can see how sometimes I'm laying it out. So I will be at this point, here. So I'll be here, I'll have it on the floor, I'll lay it out somewhere, and then I'll put different little minis next to it and around it and see how they play. Now I do have kind of a general theme. It's sort of hard to see sometimes because I am kind of loose with it. It's just kind of my impression more in the moment, and that is I have dark lines and light lines. Now, what's a dark line and a light line? Let's see if we can go over here, and there might be a little easier to tell. And sometimes they're interrupted. And sometimes my definition of what's light and what's dark changes. So let's look at this section right here. This is a pretty good section. So you can see there's a lot darks right here. So these are nice long dark lines. And then there's lights here. Now, of course, here are two lights in a row because this is a wider triangle. And I decided I'm just not going to worry about that. That's just a little odd. This one has turned into a dark because it's intense. So its function in between these two lighter colors is a dark. Well, this one is a light, and that's a light, and this one is a little bit dark. So like I said, I play a little fast and loose with that, but as a general rule, that's what I try to do. So it would go, and as I go along a row, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. Oh, I started off camera. Here we go. So this one's a light, that one's a dark, that one's a light, that one's a dark, that one's a light, that one's a dark, that one's a light. And then for those that are in bigger squares, I'll explain what all of these are as we get to them. So just some basic principles as you're setting up your initial your initial corner. So I have a little bit of a rule that the very outside edges of my blanket are going to all be single squares. So there's not going to be anything that's longer or a different length until I have my one border. So as I'm headed up this side, all of these are going to be single squares with a bigger square or a different size square, only one in. All right, let's see. What else can I tell you about this as far as setting it up and all of the details? So again, you may want to just do these 3, and you could just do this 3. You could do this one, then this one, then this one. Now, if you were going to turn this one into a rectangle instead of put up here, then you would need to do this square first. You could do your whole strip of squares along the bottom and then plan it out in the middle, however it suits. I will have an example of me showing you how I lay out and how I choose my squares. That will be another one of the tutorials. All right, so that's a little bit about how I get started, how I initially purchased enough yarn to be able to do pretty much whatever size blanket I wanted to. I probably overbought a little bit, but then you go through and lay out some stitches. So let's get started with a beginning corner square. That will be our next tutorial. I hope you found value in this tutorial. If you have, please consider a one-time payment via PayPal or a regular subscription via Patreon. The links are down below and they are on the screen. Again, thank you for joining me. See you next time.